Hello, and welcome to Nightfall Royals. Tonight, we drift through time to meet a king whose name echoes like a distant bell. Charlemagne. Charles the Great. Let your shoulders fall, your breath slow, and journey with me through the life of the man who became the father of Europe. This story begins not with fanfare, but with the tender breath of a child born into a world of shadows and light. In the year 742, when spring touched the Frankish lands with gentle fingers, a son was born to Pepin the Short and his beloved Bertrada of Leon. The child they would call Charles entered a world balanced between the fading echoes of Rome and the rising strength of new kingdoms. Charlemagne, as history would remember him, was born into the Frankish Carolingian dynasty. His father, Pepin the Short, would become the first king of this new royal line. But in those earliest days, little Charles knew only the warmth of his mother's arms and the security of family. The palace where Charlemagne spent his childhood was not the grand stone fortress we might imagine today. Instead, it was a collection of wooden halls and chambers. Here, surrounded by the sounds of daily life, the future emperor took his first steps on rushes scattered across earthen floors. His grandfather, Charles Martel, had earned great renown for halting the advance of Muslim forces at the Battle of Tours in 732. Yet, for young Charles, his grandfather was simply a figure in stories told by firelight. Family tales spoke of strength and wisdom, but also of duty to protect the Christian lands that stretched across what we now call France and Germany. Bertrada of Leon, Charlemagne's mother, came from nobility herself. She brought grace and learning to the Frankish court. Under her gentle guidance, Charles learned the manners expected of a king's son. She taught him to listen before speaking, to think before acting. These early lessons in patience would serve him well in years to come. The Carolingian dynasty was still finding its place in the complex world of 8th century Europe. Pepin the Short had received an ecclesiastical education from Christian monks. This commitment to learning and faith would become central to Charlemagne's own character. Young Charles was not an only child. He had a brother, Charlemagne, just a year younger. The two boys played together in the courtyards of their father's palaces. They learned to ride horses together, their small hands gripping reins while patient grooms walked alongside. In these peaceful moments of brotherhood, neither child could foresee that fate would make Charles the sole ruler of their realm. The education of a Frankish prince in the 8th century was practical above all else. Charles learned to read, though writing would always come less easily to him. He studied the Christian scriptures and heard tales of great kings from ages past. His tutors taught him Latin, the language of the church, and of learning. Yet, equally important were the skills of hunting, riding, and understanding the needs of the people his family governed. In quiet evening hours, when the business of the court had settled, Charles would listen to the songs of traveling poets. These wandering storytellers brought news from distant lands and tales of heroes, both real and imagined. Perhaps it was in these moments that the seeds of Charlemagne's later love for learning first took root. The Frankish kingdom in Charles's youth was a patchwork of regions and peoples. Loyalty was personal, flowing from man to man rather than to abstract ideas of nation or state. A king's strength came not from armies alone, but from the bonds of trust he could forge with the nobles who served him. Pepin the Short understood this well. He moved from palace to palace, never staying in one place too long. This allowed him to show himself to his people and to solve their disputes with his own judgment. Young Charles accompanied his father on many of these journeys, learning by watching how a king should conduct himself. The seasons turned, and Charles grew from child to boy. His limbs stretched tall and strong, Those who knew him in these years would later remember his bright eyes and ready smile. He possessed a natural curiosity about the world around him, asking questions of everyone from kitchen servants to visiting bishops. Christianity was woven through every aspect of daily life in the Carolingian court. Each day began and ended with prayer. The greatest festivals of the year followed the rhythm of the church calendar. Charles learned that to be a Christian king meant more than wearing a crown. It meant serving as God's representative on earth, protecting the weak and upholding justice. Yet even in this atmosphere of faith and learning, the realities of power were never far away. Charles saw his father make difficult decisions about war and peace, about alliance and betrayal. The boy learned that kingship carried burdens as well as privileges. As Charles passed from childhood into his youth, his education deepened like a river growing wider as it flows toward the sea. The boy, who would one day be called the father of Europe, spent these formative years absorbing the knowledge that would shape his remarkable reign. The court where Charlemagne learned was a place of constant movement and gentle activity. Unlike the fixed capitals of later kingdoms, the Frankish royal household traveled from estate to estate throughout the year. Calming storytelling of his education unfolds across many locations, from the halls of Querzy to the chambers of Attigny, from the forests of the Ardennes to the fertile plains of the Seine Valley. In each location, young Charles encountered different aspects of his future responsibilities. He learned to judge disputes between farmers over land boundaries. He watched his father hear petitions from merchants seeking protection for their trade routes. These experiences taught him that leadership meant service, not merely commanding others, but understanding their needs and concerns. The scholarly atmosphere of the Carolingian court was remarkable for its time. Scribes worked carefully in quiet rooms, copying manuscripts by hand. The scratch of quills on parchment and the soft murmur of Latin prayers created a peaceful soundtrack to learning. Charles developed his lifelong love of books in these serene surroundings. His tutors came from across Christian Europe. Irish monks brought their deep knowledge of scripture and classical learning. Scholars from Italy shared their understanding of law and administration. From these diverse teachers, Charles absorbed a broader view of the world than most rulers of his era possessed. The physical education of a young Frankish noble was equally important. Charles learned to handle sword and spear, but his true gift lay in understanding strategy rather than personal combat. He could read the landscape of a battlefield and grasp how terrain affected the movement of armies. These skills would serve him well in the campaigns that lay ahead. Hunting was both recreation and training for young Charles. In the deep forests that covered much of the Frankish kingdom, he learned patience and observation. Tracking deer taught him to notice small signs and changes. Managing hunting parties prepared him for the larger task of leading armies. The forest became his classroom, and every season brought new lessons. The religious education of Charlemagne shaped his character profoundly. He memorized long passages from Scripture and could quote the writings of church fathers. But more than mere knowledge, his faith gave him a sense of purpose. He came to see himself as God's instrument for protecting and spreading Christianity. Music filled the royal court, and Charles developed an appreciation for both secular and sacred songs. Gregorian chant echoed through palace chapels during daily services. In the evenings, harpers' melodies accompanied the recitation of epic poems about heroes of old. This bedtime history narration of his youth shows us a prince immersed in the culture of his time. The diplomatic skills that would make Charlemagne such an effective ruler were honed through countless formal occasions. He learned when to speak and when to listen, He discovered how a gesture or expression could convey messages as clearly as words. The elaborate courtesy of medieval court life became second nature to him. As Charles matured, his father began including him in more serious matters of state. The young prince sat quietly in council meetings, absorbing the discussions of experienced advisors. He learned about taxation, military organization, and the complex relationships between church and crown that characterized Frankish government. Trade was the lifeblood of the growing Carolingian realm, and Charles studied its patterns with care. Merchants brought goods from Constantinople in the east and from the ports of the Mediterranean in the south. Understanding these networks of exchange would prove crucial when Charles later worked to unite and govern his vast empire. The seasonal rhythm of medieval life provided structure to Charles's education. Spring meant preparation for military campaigns. Summer brought travel and the administration of justice in distant provinces. Autumn was time for harvest festivals and Thanksgiving. Winter allowed for study, reflection, and planning for the year ahead. Languages came naturally to the future emperor. Besides his native Frankish tongue, he spoke Latin fluently and understood enough Greek to converse with Byzantine diplomats. He even learned some Arabic words from traders and refugees, showing the cosmopolitan nature of his court. The legal traditions of the Frankish people fascinated Charles. He studied the ancient customs that governed everything from marriage to inheritance. He learned how written Roman law could complement and strengthen these oral traditions. This knowledge would later help him create a more unified legal system across his domains. Personal relationships were carefully cultivated during these years. Charles formed friendships with young nobles who would later become his most trusted advisors and commanders. The bonds forged in youth created a network of loyalty that would support his later achievements. As he approached adulthood, Charles began to understand the delicate balance of power that kept his father's kingdom stable. Regional nobles had to be managed with a combination of respect, generosity, and occasional firmness. The church required careful attention to maintain its support. Foreign enemies demanded constant vigilance. This gentle biography of Charlemagne's youth reveals a prince who was being prepared not just to inherit a crown, to expand and transform the very concept of Christian kingship. His education was creating not merely a ruler, but a visionary who would reshape the map of Europe. The years of learning were drawing to a close as Charles reached manhood. Soon he would face the first great test of his life, ruling alongside his brother after their father's death. But for now, in this peaceful moment between youth and responsibility, we can imagine him in quiet study, surrounded by books and advisors, preparing for a destiny he was only beginning to understand. In the autumn of 768, as leaves turned golden across the Frankish lands, Key penned a short, breathed his last at St. Denis. The gentle passage of seasons marked the end of one reign and the beginning of another. Charles, now 26 years old, would inherit a crown, but not alone. Following Frankish tradition, Charles became king alongside his younger brother Charlemagne. The kingdom was divided between them, as their father had planned. This was meant to maintain peace, but it carried seeds of future conflict that would test both brothers' wisdom and patience. Charles received the northern and western portions of the realm, including Neustria and parts of Aquitaine. Charlemagne took Austrasia, Alamonia, and portions of Burgundy. The division seemed fair on parchment, but ruling a divided kingdom required delicate diplomatic skill that few could master. The early years of joint rule passed quietly. Charles established his court and learned the daily rhythms of kingship. He held assemblies where nobles and bishops gathered to discuss the affairs of the realm. These meetings often lasted for days, as decisions were reached through careful consultation rather than royal decree alone. The soft-spoken historical guide that was Ironheart, Charles's future biographer, would later describe these early years as a time of growing confidence. Charles learned to balance the competing interests of different regions and social groups. He showed particular skill in maintaining the loyalty of the church while respecting the independence of powerful nobles. Military challenges arose early in Charles's reign. The Duchy of Aquitaine, in what is now southwestern France, had never fully accepted Frankish rule. Duke Wyfar continued to resist, forcing both brothers to cooperate in military campaigns. These joint expeditions strengthened their relationship and gave Charles valuable experience in command. The brothers' different personalities became apparent during these years. Charles was bold and decisive, quick to act when he saw an opportunity. Charlemagne was more cautious and reflective, preferring diplomacy to warfare. Initially, these differences complemented each other well, but they would eventually create friction. Court life during the period of joint rule maintained the traveling nature that Charles had known since childhood. The royal household moved from palace to palace, spending Christmas in one location, Easter in another. Constant movement allowed both kings to show themselves to their people and to administer justice personally. Charles's personal life also evolved during these years. His marriage to Desiderata, daughter of the Lombard king Desiderius, was arranged to secure a political alliance. However, this union would be brief and would later create complications in his relationships with both the Lombard kingdom and the papal court in Rome. The education that Charles had received in his youth now bore fruit in his approach to governance. He surrounded himself with learned advisors and maintained the scholarly atmosphere that had characterized his father's court. Monks and clerics continued to serve as scribes and administrators, bringing their knowledge to bear on the complex business of ruling. Religious observance remained central to the Carolingian court. Daily prayers marked the passage of time, and major decisions were prefaced by seeking divine guidance. Charles demonstrated genuine piety, but also understood how religious authority could support his secular power. This balance would define much of his later reign. The relationship between the two brother kings grew more strained as time passed. Disputes arose over boundaries, over the loyalty of certain nobles, and over policy decisions. What had begun as cooperation gradually became competition. Charles's more aggressive nature sometimes clashed with Charlemagne's preference for peaceful solutions. Trade and commerce flourished under the joint rule, despite occasional tensions. Merchants could travel safely through most of the Frankish lands, protected by royal guarantees. Markets expanded in the growing towns, and agricultural production increased as farmers felt secure in their holdings. This economic stability provided the foundation for future expansion. The papal court in Rome watched the Frankish brothers with great interest. The church needed strong secular allies to protect its interests in Italy against Lombard pressure. Both Charles and Charlemagne received appeals for assistance, but their responses differed in ways that revealed their contrasting approaches to foreign policy. In December 771, Charlemagne died suddenly under circumstances that history has never fully explained. Some sources suggest illness, others hint at more mysterious causes. What is certain is that his death changed everything for Charles and for the future of Europe. With Charlemagne's passing, Charles faced a choice that would define his reign. He could respect his brother's wishes and accept Charlemagne's infant sons as corollars, maintaining the tradition of divided succession. Or he could claim the entire kingdom for himself, arguing that unity would better serve their people's interests. Charles chose unity. Carloman's sudden death left Charles as the sole ruler of the Franks. This decision may have prevented civil war, but it also established a precedent for strong, centralized royal authority that would characterize the Carolingian Empire for generations to come. The moment of transition was handled with characteristic care. Achilles moved swiftly to secure the loyalty of Carloman's former supporters. He confirmed nobles in their positions and honored existing agreements. Rather than appearing as a conqueror, he presented himself as a unifier, bringing peace and stability to the realm. The transformation from joint to sole rule marked a turning point in this relaxing bedtime history story of Charlemagne's life. No longer would he need to compromise or negotiate with an equal. The full weight of royal responsibility now rested on his shoulders alone, along with all the opportunities and burdens that such power entailed. As winter settled over the Frankish lands in 771, Charles stood as undisputed king of a united realm. The education of his youth and the experience of shared rule had prepared him for this moment. Ahead lay challenges that would test every skill he had learned and every alliance he had forged. With the crown of all the Franks secure upon his head, Charles turned his attention to the unconquered lands that lay beyond his borders. To the east, across the Rhine, lived the Saxon tribes who had never bowed to Frankish rule or accepted the Christian faith. Here began the longest and most challenging campaigns of Charlemagne's reign. The Saxon Wars would span more than 30 years, testing Charles's patience, strategy, and resolve. But this bedtime history narration presents these conflicts not as tales of conquest, but as the complex story of how different peoples slowly learned to live together under one rule and one faith. The Saxon lands stretched from the Rhine to the Elbe, covering much of what is now northern Germany. These were ancient forests and fertile plains, inhabited by tribes who valued their independence above all else. They worshipped the old gods of their ancestors and viewed the Christian Franks as both political and religious threats to their way of life. Charles's first Saxon campaign began in 772 when he crossed the Rhine with a carefully organized army. His approach was methodical rather than hasty. He established supply lines and secured his flanks before advancing into enemy territory. The goal was not merely military victory, but the establishment of lasting Frankish authority. The destruction of the Irminsul, a sacred Saxon pillar, marked Charles's first major symbolic victory. This ancient wooden column represented the Saxons' connection to their traditional beliefs. By toppling it, Charles announced that the old order was ending and a new Christian age was beginning. Yet he understood that changing hearts would take longer than changing symbols. The Saxon leader Witikind emerged as Charles's most persistent opponent. Kind was a noble of intelligence and determination who understood that Saxon independence depended on unity among the various tribes. He proved masterful at guerrilla warfare, appearing when least expected and vanishing into the deep forests when pursued. Charles responded to Saxon resistance with a combination of military pressure and patient diplomacy. He built fortifications at strategic points to control key river crossings and mountain passes. He also offered generous terms to Saxon nobles who submitted voluntarily, understanding that lasting peace required willing cooperation rather than mere defeat. The Carolingian approach to conquest included immediate attention to religious conversion. Missionary bishops accompanied the armies, ready to baptize Saxon converts and establish new churches. Charles believed deeply that political unity and religious unity went hand in hand, that his empire would be strongest when when all his subjects shared the same faith. The most tragic episode of the Saxon Wars occurred at Verdun in 782, where thousands of Saxon prisoners were executed after a failed rebellion. This harsh act, which Charles may have later regretted, showed the limits of his patience when faced with repeated Saxon betrayals of sworn agreements. The gentle biography we tell tonight acknowledges this darkness, while remembering that medieval warfare was brutal for all participants. Between major campaigns, Charles implemented policies designed to integrate Saxon society into the broader Frankish realm. He established counties governed by Frankish administrators, but often staffed with converted Saxons. He encouraged intermarriage between Frankish and Saxon nobles. These measures gradually created bonds of interest and kinship that made rebellion less appealing. The role of Queen Hildegard, Charles's second wife, was important during these years of constant warfare. While her husband campaigned in distant lands, she managed the court and maintained communication with allied rulers throughout Europe. Her wisdom and grace helped sustain the complex network of relationships that supported Charles's expanding realm. Saxon resistance was not uniform across all the tribes. Some groups submitted early and prospered under Frankish rule. Goths maintained their opposition for decades. Goths learned to distinguish between different Saxon regions and to tailor his policies accordingly. This flexible approach ultimately proved more successful than treating all Saxons identically. The gradual Christianization of Saxon lands required enormous resources and patience. New churches were built in every conquered district. Monasteries were established to serve as centers of learning and religious instruction. Saxon children began learning Latin alongside their native tongue, preparing them for participation in the broader Christian culture of the Carolingian Empire. Charles's strategy included the systematic replacement of pagan festivals with Christian celebrations. The winter solstice, became Christmas. Spring fertility rites were transformed into Easter observances. By adapting, rather than simply destroying Saxon traditions, the Frankish administration made the transition to Christianity less jarring for ordinary people. The economics of conquest were carefully managed. Saxon tribute helped fund further military campaigns, but Charles also invested heavily in the development of conquered territories. Roads were built to improve communication. Markets were established to encourage trade. The message was clear. Submission to Frankish rule brought material benefits as well as spiritual salvation. Wittekind's eventual submission in 785 marked a turning point in the Saxon Wars. The Saxon leader accepted baptism and became Charles's ally rather than his enemy. This transformation from bitter foe to trusted supporter exemplified Charles's ultimate goal, not the destruction of his enemies, but their conversion into loyal subjects and fellow Christians. The later phases of the Saxon Wars focused on consolidating gains rather than conquering new territory. Charles established a network of strongholds throughout the region and settled Frankish colonists in strategic locations. These measures ensured that Saxon resistance could never again threaten the stability of the empire. The integration of Saxon soldiers into Charles's armies proved the success of his long-term strategy. Former enemies became defenders of the empire they had once fought against. Saxon cavalry would eventually serve in campaigns as distant as Spain and Italy, demonstrating their complete transformation from foes to allies. Religious education received special attention in the conquered Saxon lands. Schools were established to train Saxon clergy who could minister to their own people in their native language. This approach recognized that lasting religious conversion required understanding rather than mere compliance. The Saxon Wars tested every aspect of Charles's leadership abilities. Qui, they required military skill, diplomatic finesse, administrative competence, and unwavering determination. Quis, the successful conclusion of these campaigns, established Charles as the dominant power in northern Europe and secured the eastern borders of his growing empire. This chapter rests now, like a sword returning to its scabbard after long use. Let us pause here in peace, as the Saxon lands gradually embraced their new faith and their new king. When you are ready, we will continue onward into the years when Charles would turn his attention southward, toward Italy and the heart of the Christian world, while the Saxon wars continued their slow course in the north. Charles's attention was drawn southward across the Alps to the sun-warmed lands of Italy. Here, among olive groves and ancient Roman ruins, lay both opportunity and obligation that would reshape the Christian world forever. Charles would become king of the Lombards in 774, adding another crown to his growing collection of titles. But this gentle biography reveals that his involvement in Italy began not from ambition alone, but from a complex web of family, faith, and politics that drew him southward like a tide. The Lombard kingdom in northern Italy had existed for over 2 centuries, carved from the remnants of Roman territory by Germanic tribes who had settled in the fertile Po Valley. Their capital, at Pavia, was a city of learning and culture, where Roman traditions blended with Germanic customs to create something uniquely Italian. King Desiderius of the Lombards was Charles's former father-in-law. The relationship complicated by Charles's annulment of his marriage to Desiderata years earlier. This personal slight had created lasting resentment that would influence the political situation throughout the Italian peninsula. Royal marriages in medieval Europe were matters of state, and their dissolution could have far-reaching consequences. The papal court in Rome watched the growing tension between Franks and Lombards with great concern. The Pope ruled the papal states in central Italy, but these territories were under constant pressure from Lombard expansion southward. Pope Leo III and his predecessors needed a strong ally to protect the Church's temporal interests. The relationship between the Carolingian dynasty and the papacy had deep roots. Charles's father, Pepin the Short, had been crowned king with papal blessing, establishing the principle that Christian kingship required church approval. In return, the Franks had become the Church's primary secular protectors, committed to defending papal rights against all enemies. In 773, Pope Adrian I sent urgent appeals to Charles, requesting immediate assistance against Lombard aggression. Desiderius had broken previous agreements and was threatening Roman territory directly. The message was clear. Either the Franks would honor their commitment to protect the Church, or papal support for Carolingian rule might be reconsidered. Charles's decision to intervene in Italy was made after careful consultation with his advisors. The risks were significant. Crossing the Alps with an army was always dangerous, and fighting in unfamiliar territory presented numerous challenges. The potential rewards included not only papal gratitude, but also control of the wealthy Italian cities that dominated Mediterranean trade. The Alpine crossing in the autumn of 773 demonstrated Charles's growing mastery of military logistics. His army moved through the mountain passes with careful planning, carrying sufficient supplies while maintaining the speed necessary to achieve surprise. Local guides helped navigate the treacherous paths, while advanced scouts secured the route against Lombard ambushes. The siege of Pavia began in the winter of 773 and continued through the following spring. Charles demonstrated remarkable patience during these months, understanding that a long siege would ultimately be less costly than a hasty assault. He used the time to consolidate his control over other Lombard cities and to negotiate with potential allies. Aquana, Italy. During the siege, Charles made a pilgrimage to Rome that would have profound consequences for both his reign and the future of Europe. This visit in early 774 marked the first time a Frankish king had entered the Eternal City since the days of the Roman Empire. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Here was a barbarian king walking where Caesars once ruled. Pope Adrian I received Charles with elaborate ceremony, recognizing both his practical importance as a military ally and his spiritual significance as a Christian ruler. The meetings between Pope and King established protocols that would govern church-state relations for centuries to come. Mutual respect and shared interests created a partnership that would reshape medieval Europe. The formal donation of territories to the papal court during Charles's Roman visit confirmed Frankish commitment to protecting church interests. This arrangement, building on earlier agreements made by Pepin the Short, established the papal states as a permanent feature of Italian politics. The church gained temporal authority over central Italy, while the Franks gained a grateful and powerful ally. When Pavia finally surrendered in June 774, Charles handled the victory with characteristic wisdom. Rather than sacking the city or humiliating its defenders, he respected Lombard customs and incorporated existing nobles into his administration. Stesiarus was sent into honorable exile at a Frankish monastery, ending his reign but preserving his dignity. The assumption of the title King of the Lombards marked Charles's transformation from a regional Frankish ruler into a European sovereign. He now ruled territories on both sides of the Alps, requiring new approaches to administration and communication. The challenge of governing such a diverse empire would test all his skills as a leader. The integration of Lombard Italy into the growing Carolingian realm was managed with care and patience. Existing laws were largely maintained, and local customs were respected. Lombard nobles who submitted voluntarily were confirmed in their positions, while those who resisted faced replacement by Frankish administrators. This flexible approach minimized disruption while ensuring loyalty. The wealth of northern Italy provided new resources for Charles's continuing military campaigns. Italian cities contributed taxes and troops, while Italian merchants helped finance royal expeditions. The economic integration of Italy into the Frankish realm created prosperity that benefited all of Charles's subjects, from the Atlantic to the Adriatic. Cultural exchange between Franks and Lombards enriched both peoples. Italian scholars brought knowledge of Roman law and classical literature to northern courts, while Frankish administrators introduced new methods of governance and military organization. This blending of traditions would become characteristic of the Carolingian Renaissance that was beginning to flourish. The security of the Alpine passes became a permanent concern for Charles's administration. Fortifications were built at key locations, and reliable communication systems were established to ensure rapid contact between the Italian and Transalpine portions of the realm. These measures created the infrastructure necessary for effective rule over such vast territories. Religious reform in Italy received careful attention from Charles and his advisors. Monasteries were encouraged to return to strict observance of their rules. Clerical education was improved through the establishment of cathedral schools. The quality of religious life throughout the Italian peninsula gradually improved under Carolingian influence. The successful integration of Lombard Italy demonstrated Charles's evolution from a tribal king to an imperial administrator. The skills required to govern diverse peoples with different languages, laws, and customs were far more complex than those needed to rule the relatively homogeneous Frankish heartland. His success in Italy proved that he was ready for even greater challenges ahead. As the 8th century drew toward its close, Charles had become the most powerful ruler in Western Europe since the fall of Rome. His armies had conquered vast territories. His administration governed diverse peoples, and his alliance with the Church had grown ever stronger. Yet the greatest moment of his life was still to come, a moment that would be born from crisis and transform European history forever. In the year 799, Pope Leo III faced a severe challenge to his authority in Rome. Roman nobles, led by the nephews of the previous pope, accused Leo of serious crimes and attempted to remove him from office. The situation grew violent when the conspirators attacked the pope during a religious procession, trying to blind him and cut out his tongue. Though Leo escaped a serious injury, his position remained precarious. The embattled pope fled north across the Alps, seeking refuge with Charles at his palace in Paderborn. This dramatic flight brought the supreme head of the Christian Church to the court of the Frankish king as a supplicant, reversing the usual relationship between secular and spiritual authority. Charles received his guests with honor, while carefully considering how to respond to this unprecedented situation. The meeting at Paderborn in the summer of 799 was conducted with the greatest secrecy and ceremony. Pope Leo III needed Charles's protection to regain his papal throne, while Charles recognized an opportunity to demonstrate his role as the Church's primary defender. Their discussions would lay the groundwork for events that would echo through centuries. Charles's decision to escort Pope Leo back to Rome was made after careful consultation with his advisors. The risks were considerable. Intervening in papal politics could create lasting enemies among the Roman nobility. Yet, the potential benefits were even greater. By restoring the Pope, Charles would establish himself as the ultimate guarantor of Christian order in Europe. The journey southward in the autumn of 800 was organized as a royal progress rather than a military campaign. Charles brought a substantial entourage of nobles, clergy, and scholars, demonstrating that this was a peaceful mission rather than an armed intervention. The careful choreography of the expedition showed Charles's growing understanding of symbolic politics. Rome in December 800 was a city transformed by centuries of decline, but still magnificent in its ancient grandeur. The population had shrunk dramatically since imperial times. Yet the great basilicas and classical monuments remained as testimony to past glory. For Charles, entering the Eternal City as his protector must have been a moment of profound emotion. The investigation into the charges against Pope Leo III was conducted with scrupulous attention to both justice and diplomacy. Charles personally presided over hearings that allowed accusers to present their evidence, while giving the Pope opportunity to respond. The proceedings established important precedents for the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. When Pope Leo III took a solemn oath proclaiming his innocence of all charges, the crisis that had brought Charles to Rome was resolved. The papal authority was restored, and the Roman conspirators were dealt with mercifully but firmly. Charles had successfully fulfilled his role as protector of the Church, but the most dramatic moment was yet to come. Christmas Day 800 began like any other major Christian festival. Charles attended morning prayers and prepared for the solemn High Mass at St. Peter's Basilica. Contemporary accounts suggest he had no forewarning of what Pope Leo III had planned for that holy day. The events that would unfold were surprising to the Frankish king, as they were momentous for European history. The coronation of Charlemagne as emperor on Christmas Day 800 took place during the Christmas Mass before the assembled congregation of Roman nobles, Frankish dignitaries, and pilgrims from throughout the Christian world. Charles rose from prayer before the altar of St. Peter. Pope Leo III approached, carrying a golden crown. The words spoken as the crown was placed upon Charles's head proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans, a title that had not been held by a Western ruler for over 3 centuries. The congregation responded with ritual acclamations, recognizing their new emperor according to ancient custom. In that sacred moment, the Western Roman Empire was reborn under Frankish leadership. Charles's initial reaction to his coronation has been debated by historians for over 1,000 years. His biographer, Einhard, claimed that the king was taken by surprise and would never have entered the church if he had known what was planned. Yet the careful preparation required for such a ceremony suggests that Charles must have given at least tacit consent to the proceedings. The immediate consequences of the imperial coronation were felt throughout Europe and beyond. In Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor and his court viewed the creation of a new Western emperor as a direct challenge to their authority. They considered themselves the sole legitimate heirs of Rome. And Charles's coronation threatened their exclusive claim to imperial dignity. The title of emperor transformed Charles's relationship with other European rulers. Kings who had previously treated him as an equal now found themselves technically his vassals, at least in theory. This shift in status required delicate diplomatic management to avoid alienating allies who might resent their new subordinate position. Charles himself adapted to his imperial role with characteristic wisdom and restraint. He understood that the crown brought responsibilities as well as honors. An emperor was expected to protect all Christians, not merely his own subjects. This expanded mandate would influence his policies for the remainder of his reign. The imperial coronation represented the culmination of centuries of cooperation between the Frankish monarchy and the Roman Church. By crowning Charles, Pope Leo III acknowledged that the Franks had become the Church's primary protectors, and that their king deserved recognition as the supreme Christian ruler in Western Europe. The ceremony at St. Peter's also demonstrated the Pope's authority to grant and legitimize imperial power. This precedent would have enormous consequences for medieval politics, establishing the principle that no emperor could rule without ecclesiastical approval. The balance between church and state was forever altered by that Christmas morning in Rome. The practical effects of becoming emperor were felt immediately in Charles's administration. Imperial titles required imperial ceremony, and the Frankish court adapted its protocols accordingly. New seals were created bearing the imperial insignia. Documents began to refer to Charles by his new title. The transformation from king to emperor was made visible in countless small details. The legal implications of the imperial title were equally significant. Roman law, which had been gradually superseding tribal customs throughout Charles's territories, now received additional legitimacy. As Emperor of the Romans, Charles could claim authority over all legal traditions that traced their origins to ancient Rome. The economic benefits of imperial status included enhanced prestige in trade relationships throughout the Mediterranean world. Merchants from Byzantine territories, Muslim lands, and distant kingdoms recognized the political importance of the new Western Empire. Commercial agreements negotiated by imperial representatives carried additional weight. The military advantages of imperial dignity were more symbolic than practical. Charles's armies were no stronger after his coronation than before, but they now fought under the banners of a revived Roman Empire. This psychological factor may have influenced both allies and enemies in their calculations about Carolingian power. The religious significance of the imperial coronation extended far beyond mere politics. Charles now bore responsibility for the welfare of all Christians in his territories, regardless of their tribal or national origins. This universal mandate required policies that transcended narrow ethnic interests in favor of broader Christian unity. The scholarly community throughout Europe responded enthusiastically to the restoration of the Western Empire. Learned men saw in Charles's coronation the fulfillment of prophecies about Christian unity and the renewal of ancient glory. Schools and monasteries composed hymns and poems celebrating the new emperor and his achievements. Yet, the coronation also created new challenges that would test Charles's diplomatic skills. The relationship with the Byzantine Empire became more complex and potentially hostile. Negotiations would be required to establish acceptable protocols for communication between the two emperors without either side losing face. The Papal Imperial Alliance forged on Christmas Day 800 established patterns that would dominate European politics for centuries. Future emperors would seek papal coronation to legitimize their authority, while popes would use the threat of excommunication to influence imperial policy. The seeds of both cooperation and conflict were planted in that moment. Charles's reaction to his new status evolved gradually during the months following his coronation. Initially cautious about the implications of imperial dignity, he gradually embraced the opportunities it provided for advancing Christian civilization. The title gave him a platform for promoting learning, justice, and religious reform throughout his territories. The imperial court developed new traditions appropriate to its elevated status. Ceremonial practices borrowed from both Frankish customs and memories of ancient Rome. Foreign ambassadors were received with greater pomp, and internal court procedures became more elaborate. The transformation of royal into imperial dignity was made manifest in every aspect of daily life. With the weight of imperial dignity upon his shoulders, Charlemagne turned his attention to creating something that would outlast any military conquest, a renaissance of learning that would illuminate the darkness of early medieval Europe. At his palace in Aachen, he gathered the greatest minds of his age, creating what historians would later call the Carolingian Renaissance. This soft-spoken historical guide to Charlemagne's cultural achievements reveals how a warrior emperor became the patron of scholarship and the arts. The transformation was gradual but profound, reflecting Charles's deep understanding that true empire rested not merely on military might, but on the foundation of knowledge and faith. Aachen became the permanent capital of the Carolingian Empire around 805, chosen for its strategic location and its natural hot springs. Charles commissioned the construction of a magnificent palace complex that would serve as both the seat of government and a center of learning. The palace chapel, inspired by the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna, demonstrated the emperor's commitment to creating architecture worthy of his imperial status. The palace school at Aachen attracted scholars from across Europe and beyond. Alcuin of York, perhaps the greatest educator of his age, left his position in England to serve as Charles's chief advisor on educational matters. From Ireland came learned monks who preserved classical knowledge in their remote monasteries. Italian scholars brought expertise in Roman law and ancient literature. Together, they created an intellectual community unlike anything seen in Western Europe for centuries. Alcuin's influence on Carolingian education cannot be overstated. This gentle Englishman developed curricula that balanced Christian learning with classical knowledge. He established the 7 liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy as the foundation of medieval education. His methods would influence European schools for centuries to come. The emperor himself was an eager student in this palace school. Despite his advanced age and imperial responsibilities, Charles continued his own education with remarkable enthusiasm. He learned to read Greek, studied mathematics, and attempted to master the art of writing, though fine penmanship always challenged his large hands that were better suited to holding swords than quills. Charlemagne's commitment to learning extended far beyond personal interest. He issued capitularies requiring every monastery and cathedral to maintain schools for the education of both clergy and the people. This educational mandate represented one of the first systematic attempts at mass literacy in post-Roman Europe. The development of a new script, known as Carolingian minuscule, revolutionized the copying and preservation of manuscripts. Its clear, elegant handwriting replaced the various regional scripts that had made communication between different parts of the empire difficult. The new script was easier to read and faster to write, dramatically improving administrative efficiency. Scriptoria throughout the empire worked tirelessly to copy ancient texts that might otherwise have been lost forever. Classical works by authors like Virgil, Ovid, and Cicero were preserved alongside Christian writings by the Church Fathers. This systematic preservation effort saved countless ancient works for future generations. The palace library at Aachen became one of the largest collections of books in Western Europe. Charles personally supervised the acquisition of manuscripts, often requesting specific texts from monasteries and scholars throughout his territories. The library included works in Latin, Greek, and even some Arabic texts obtained through trade with the Islamic world. Music flourished under Carolingian patronage. The emperor standardized liturgical chant throughout his empire, establishing what would become known as Gregorian chant. Palace musicians composed new melodies and refined existing ones, creating a musical tradition that would define Christian worship for centuries. The visual arts experienced a remarkable revival during Charles's reign. Illuminated manuscripts from Carolingian scriptoria displayed unprecedented beauty and sophistication. Ivory carvings, metalwork, and stone sculpture all reflected the influence of classical models while developing distinctively Carolingian characteristics. Architecture reached new heights under imperial patronage. The palace complex at Aachen included not only the famous octagonal chapel, but also a great hall for imperial ceremonies and numerous smaller buildings for administration and housing. The architectural program proclaimed the emperor's status on providing practical facilities for governing a vast empire. Legal scholarship received particular attention from Charlemagne and his advisors. The complexity of governing territories with different legal traditions required systematic study of both Roman law and Germanic customs. Imperial legal experts worked to create unified codes that could be applied consistently throughout the empire, while respecting local variations where appropriate. The palace became a center for diplomatic activity, as ambassadors from throughout the known world came to pay their respects to the emperor. Visitors from Byzantium, the Islamic world, and distant kingdoms were received with ceremonies that demonstrated its Carolingian cultural sophistication as well as political power. Scientific learning, though limited by medieval standards, was actively encouraged at the Carolingian court. Scholars studied astronomy, mathematics, and natural philosophy within the framework of Christian understanding. The goal was not to challenge religious doctrine, but to better understand God's creation through systematic observation and reasoning. The role of women in Carolingian intellectual life was more significant than in many later periods. Several of Charles's daughters received excellent educations and participated actively in court cultural activities. Monasteries for women became centers of learning where nuns copied manuscripts and maintained schools for girls. Poetry and literature flourished as court writers composed works celebrating the emperor and his achievements. Epic poems in both Latin and vernacular languages preserved heroic traditions while adapting them to Christian themes. These literary works helped create a distinctively Carolingian cultural identity. The influence of the palace school extended far beyond Aachen itself. Students trained there returned to their home regions carrying Carolingian educational methods and cultural ideals. This dispersal of knowledge created a network of schools and scholars that spread the Renaissance throughout Western Europe. Charlemagne's educational reforms had profound long-term consequences. The preservation of classical texts during the Carolingian Renaissance ensured that later generations would have access to ancient wisdom. The establishment of systematic education created literate, administrative classes that could govern the complex medieval kingdoms that followed. The emperor's commitment to learning was rooted in his deep Christian faith. He saw education as a religious duty, believing that God expected Christians to develop their intellectual gifts as fully as their spiritual ones. This integration of faith and reason would become characteristic of medieval Christian culture. Trade in books and manuscripts flourished under imperial protection. Merchants specialized in carrying texts between different regions of the empire, creating a market for intellectual products that encouraged further scholarly production. The economic value of learning was recognized and supported by imperial policy. The daily routine of the palace reflected Charles's priorities. Mornings were devoted to governmental business, but afternoons often featured scholarly discussions, literary recitations, or educational debates. The emperor's personal participation in these activities demonstrated that learning was not merely decoration, but central to imperial identity. This bedtime history narration of Charlemagne's cultural achievements shows how military conquest was transformed into intellectual construction. The weapons of war were supplemented by the tools of peace, books, schools, and the patient work of education that would outlast any battlefield victory. This chapter rests now like a manuscript carefully placed upon a library shelf. Let us pause here in peace as scholars work by candlelight in the palace scriptorium, preserving ancient wisdom for future generations. When you are ready, we will continue onward into the personal life of the emperor, where we will discover the man behind the crown, beyond the imperial ceremonies and the grand affairs of state. There lived a man of flesh and blood, with personal joys and sorrows that made Charlemagne more than just a distant figure from history. This gentle biography now turns to the private moments that revealed the human heart beating beneath the crown of empire. Charlemagne was a man of impressive physical presence, standing well above average height in an age when most people were considerably shorter than today. Contemporary accounts describe him as robust and vigorous, with fair hair that grew white with age and bright, intelligent eyes that missed little of what occurred around him. His voice was higher than one might expect from such a large man, but it carried well in both intimate conversation and public address. The emperor's daily routine reflected both his responsibilities and his personal preferences. He rose early, as was customary in medieval times, and began each day with prayers in his private chapel. After attending to urgent governmental matters, he enjoyed a substantial breakfast that often included fresh bread, cheese, roasted meat, and ale or wine diluted with water. Physical exercise remained important to Charles throughout his life. Even as he aged, he continued to hunt regularly in the forests around his palaces. Swimming was a particular passion. The thermal pools at Aachen provided perfect venues for this activity, and the emperor often invited guests to join him in the warm waters. These informal gatherings sometimes proved more productive for diplomatic negotiations than formal state meetings. Family life was central to Charlemagne's personal happiness, though it was complicated by the political necessities of royal marriages. He wed 5 times during his life, with each marriage serving diplomatic purposes while hopefully providing personal companionship. His relationships with his wives varied considerably, but all were conducted with the courtesy expected of a Christian emperor. His first wife, Himiltrude, bore him a son named Pippin, though the legitimacy of this union was later questioned when political circumstances required different alliances. A marriage to Desiderata, daughter of the Lombard king, was brief and politically motivated, ending when Charles's Italian policy shifted. His relationship with Hildegard proved more enduring and personally satisfying. Queen Hildegard, his third wife, was beloved by Charles and became the mother of several of his children, including his eventual successor, Louis the Pious. Her intelligence and grace made her an effective partner in the complex social life of the court. When she died in 783, Charles was deeply grieved and took considerable time before remarrying. The emperor's children brought him enormous joy and occasional worry. He was an unusually devoted father for a medieval ruler, personally supervising their education and spending time with them despite his heavy governmental responsibilities. His sons were trained in statecraft and military leadership, while his daughters received educations that were remarkably advanced for their time. Charles's daughters were particularly dear to him, and he was reluctant to see them marry and leave his court. His protective attitude led to some criticism, as several of his daughters bore children outside of wedlock. Yet the emperor provided for all his grandchildren with affection and care, demonstrating that family bonds meant more to him than social conventions. The imperial court was a complex social environment that required careful management. Nobles from across the empire gathered at Aachen, bringing their regional customs and personal ambitions. Charles proved masterful at balancing these various interests while maintaining his own authority. His personal charm and genuine interest in people helped create loyalty that extended far beyond mere political calculation. Dining at the imperial table was both pleasure and diplomacy for Charles. He enjoyed good food and conversation, often extending meals far beyond mere necessity to allow for discussions of literature, theology, or current events. The emperor's table was famous throughout Europe for both its abundance and its intellectual discourse. Music played an important role in Charles's personal life. He appreciated both sacred and secular songs, often requesting performances during evening gatherings. The emperor had a good ear for melody and sometimes participated in singing, though his voice was better suited to conversation than musical performance. Court musicians composed pieces specifically for his enjoyment. Reading remained a challenge for Charles throughout his life, despite his obvious intelligence and extensive education. The fine motor skills required for writing came even harder to his large hands. Yet, he persisted in his studies, often having scribes read to him while he worked on other tasks. His genuine love of learning overcame any embarrassment about these difficulties. The emperor's relationships with his advisors revealed much about his character. He chose men of ability, regardless of their social origins, promoting talented individuals who might have remained obscure under other rulers. Yet, he also demanded complete honesty from those who served him, preferring harsh truths to pleasant falsehoods. Alcuin of York enjoyed an unusually close relationship with Charles, serving not only as educational advisor but as personal friend. Their correspondence, which survives in part, reveals an emperor capable of self-doubt and reflection despite his public confidence. The queen could challenge Charles's decisions in ways that few others dared attempt. Religious observance was genuine and deep for Charlemagne, though it coexisted comfortably with worldly pleasures. He attended daily mass and observed the liturgical calendar faithfully. Yet, he also enjoyed hunting, feasting, and other secular activities without apparent conflict. His Christianity was practical rather than mystical, focused on building God's kingdom on earth. The emperor's generosity was legendary among his contemporaries. He gave freely to churches, monasteries, and individuals in need, understanding that royal largesse was both a Christian duty and a political necessity. Yet, his gifts were never random. Charles carefully considered how each act of generosity might serve broader purposes of justice and good governance. Personal hygiene was important to Charles, though medieval standards differed considerably from modern expectations. The thermal baths at Aachen allowed for regular bathing, which was unusual for the time. He maintained his appearance carefully, understanding that imperial dignity required appropriate presentation in all public appearances. The emperor aged gracefully, remaining active well into his 70s, despite the physical demands of constant travel and military campaigning. His energy seemed inexhaustible to those around him, though private moments surely brought the aches and limitations that come to all mortal flesh. He adapted his activities gradually, relying more on trusted subordinates while maintaining ultimate authority. Sleep came easily to Charles, perhaps because his days were filled with productive activity. He often retired early and rose before dawn, maximizing the daylight hours available for his numerous responsibilities. Dreams, when he remembered them, seemed to focus on practical matters rather than flights of fancy. The emperor's sense of humor was earthy and direct, appropriate to his Germanic background, but refined by years of courtly life. He enjoyed practical jokes and witty conversation, though always within limits appropriate to his imperial dignity. Laughter was common in his presence, creating an atmosphere that encouraged creativity and honest communication. Charles's relationship with money was typically medieval, generous when generosity served his purposes, but careful about waste. He understood that imperial resources belonged ultimately to his people rather than to himself personally. Counting was maintained carefully, and expenditures were justified in terms of their benefit to the empire as a whole. The inevitability of aging became apparent to Charles as he entered his 70s. Yet, rather than retreating from active leadership, he intensified his efforts to prepare his succession and complete his life's work. The emperor, who had never hesitated to face enemies on battlefield, now confronted his greatest challenge, ensuring that his achievements would survive his own mortality. As the new century dawned in 801, Charlemagne entered the final phase of his remarkable life. The emperor, who had once crossed the mountains with the vigor of youth, now felt the accumulated weight of decades spent in service to his people and his God. Yet, this relaxing bedtime history story reveals that his later years brought not decline, but a different kind of greatness, the wisdom that comes only through long experience. The first years of the 9th century found Charles increasingly concerned with the organization and preservation of his vast empire. Military campaigns still demanded his attention, but administrative reforms occupied more of his time. The emperor understood that lasting achievements required careful planning and systematic implementation, qualities that age had helped refine in his character. The Saxon Wars, which had dominated so many years of his reign, finally reached their conclusion during this period. The last major rebellion was suppressed in 804, marking the end of more than 3 decades of conflict. Charles's patient policy of gradual integration had ultimately succeeded where force alone might have failed. The former enemies were now loyal subjects, and their lands were secure within the Christian empire. Charles's attention to education intensified as he recognized that knowledge would be his most enduring legacy. The palace school at Aachen continued to flourish, but the emperor also focused on establishing schools throughout his territories. He issued detailed instructions for educational curricula and personally examined the progress being made in various regions of the empire. The standardization of weights, measures, currency occupied much of Charles's administrative attention during these years. Trade had grown enormously under his rule, but regional variations in standards created unnecessary complications for merchants. The emperor's reforms in this area helped create the economic unity that would support European commerce for centuries. Legal reform was another major concern of Charles's later years. The diversity of laws throughout his empire created confusion and sometimes injustice. Working with learned advisors, the emperor attempted to create more uniform legal standards while respecting local customs where appropriate. This delicate balance required all his accumulated wisdom and diplomatic skill. The relationship with the Byzantine Empire remained complex throughout this period. The Eastern emperors never fully accepted the legitimacy of Charles's imperial title, but practical necessity forced both sides to establish working diplomatic relationships. Marriage negotiations between the two imperial families were discussed, but never concluded, though they helped reduce tensions. Charles's family life during his later years was marked by both joy and sorrow. The deaths of several of his children, including his eldest son Charles the Younger in 811, brought grief that the emperor bore with characteristic stoicism. Yet the presence of grandchildren at court provided new sources of happiness and hope for the future. The succession question became increasingly pressing as Charles entered his 70s. The Frankish tradition of dividing inheritances among all sons conflicted with the practical need for imperial unity. Charles struggled with this dilemma for years before finally settling on his surviving son, Louis, as sole heir, a decision that would have profound consequences for European history. Religious concerns occupied more of the emperor's time as he aged. He increased his charitable giving and spent longer hours in prayer and meditation. Yet this was not the retreat of an old man from worldly affairs, but rather the deeper integration of faith with governance that had always characterized his rule. The imperial court continued to function as a center of learning and culture, though the atmosphere gradually became more serious and reflective. Younger scholars still came to Aachen seeking education and advancement, but they found an environment shaped by the mature wisdom of their emperor rather than the energetic optimism of earlier years. Architecture projects during this period reflected Charles's concern for permanence and legacy. The palace complex at Aachen was expanded and beautified, while churches and monasteries throughout the empire received imperial patronage for construction and renovation. These buildings were designed to last for centuries, carrying forward the Carolingian vision of Christian civilization. The emperor's daily routine changed gradually to accommodate his aging body, while maintaining his essential responsibilities. He rose somewhat later than in his youth, but worked longer into the evening. Physical exercise remained important, though hunting expeditions became less frequent and swimming sessions in the thermal pools were sometimes purely therapeutic rather than recreational. Charles's relationships with his advisors evolved as he came to rely more heavily on their expertise while maintaining ultimate authority. Alcuin had returned to England, but other learned men continued to serve the imperial court. The emperor's ability to delegate responsibility while retaining control demonstrated the management skills he had developed over decades of rule. The economy of the empire flourished under Charles's careful administration. Agricultural production increased due to improved security and better farming techniques. Trade routes were protected and standardized, encouraging commerce throughout Europe and beyond. The stability created by effective governance generated prosperity that benefited all levels of society. Military organization was refined during these years to meet the changing needs of the empire. The traditional Frankish levy was supplemented by more professional forces. Fortifications were built at strategic locations to protect against external threats. Charles understood that military preparedness was essential for maintaining the peace he had worked so hard to achieve. Diplomatic relationships with the neighboring powers required constant attention. The Islamic rulers of Spain remained potential threats, while various Eastern European peoples sought either alliance or autonomy. Charles managed these complex relationships with the skill of a statesman who understood that negotiation was often more effective than warfare. The emperor's concern for justice remained strong throughout his later years. He continued to hear appeals personally and to issue detailed instructions to his administrators about fair treatment of all subjects. Capitularies issued during this period demonstrate Charles's commitment to creating legal systems that protected both the powerful and the powerless. Cultural achievements during Charles's final years included some of the greatest works of the Carolingian Renaissance. Illuminated manuscripts from this period display unmatched artistic sophistication, while literary works achieved new levels of elegance and learning. The emperor's patronage created conditions for cultural flowering that would influence European civilization for centuries. The thermal baths at Aachen became increasingly important to Charles as therapeutic treatments for the ailments of age. Yet, even these sessions often included informal meetings with advisors or visiting dignitaries. The emperor's ability to combine personal care with governmental business demonstrated his efficient use of every available moment. Charles's correspondence during his later years reveals a man deeply concerned with the spiritual welfare of his subjects as well as their temporal prosperity. He wrote frequently to bishops and abbots, offering guidance on religious matters while seeking their prayers for his own salvation. The integration of earthly and heavenly concerns characterized his mature approach to leadership. The training of his son Louis in imperial responsibilities occupied much of Charles's attention during these final years. The future emperor was gradually given more authority, while his father remained available for guidance and correction. This careful preparation helped ensure a smooth transition when the time came for succession. Personal reflection became more common for Charles as he contemplated the achievements and failures of his long reign. He had succeeded in creating a vast Christian empire, but he also understood the fragility of human institutions. His later policies were designed to provide stability that could survive the inevitable changes ahead. This chapter rests now, like wisdom settling slowly into an aged but still vigorous mind. Let us pause here in peace as the emperor prepares for sleep in his chamber, surrounded by the accumulated treasures of a lifetime spent in service. When you are ready, we will continue onward to that final winter when mortality would claim even the greatest of earthly rulers. The winter of 813 came early to the palace at Aachen, bringing with it a chill that seemed to reach deeper than mere seasonal cold. Charlemagne, now past his 70th year, felt the approach of something greater than winter, the eternal season that comes to all mortal men, regardless of their earthly achievements. Yet, this soft-spoken historical guide to his final months reveals not decline, but the peaceful culmination of a life lived in service to God and man. The emperor's daily routine changed little. Despite his advancing age and the increasing frailty that he could no longer hide from those closest to him, each morning still found him in prayer at his private chapel, though he now leaned more heavily on the carved oak staff that had become his constant companion. The thermal baths that had once been pleasure became necessity, easing the stiffness that settled in his joints like frost on autumn leaves. In September of 813, Charles took the unprecedented step of crowning his son Louis as conqueror in a ceremony at Aachen. This decision broke with tradition in several ways. The coronation took place without papal participation, and it occurred while the senior emperor still lived and reigned. Charles understood that the succession needed to be secured beyond any possibility of dispute. The coronation ceremony was conducted with imperial dignity, but also with the intimate character of a father passing his life's work to his son. Charles personally placed the crown upon Louis's head and spoke words of blessing and instruction that moved all who witnessed the scene. The old emperor's voice, though somewhat weakened by age, still carried the authority that had commanded respect throughout Europe for more than 4 decades. The relationship between father and son during these final months was marked by mutual respect and genuine affection. Louis had been carefully prepared for his inheritance, and Charles took satisfaction in seeing his policies continued and refined by capable hands. The emperor could rest easier knowing that his life's work would not die with him. Throughout the autumn of 813, Charles continued to receive diplomatic embassies and to conduct the essential business of governing his vast territories. His mind remained sharp and his judgment sound, so those who knew him well noticed that he tired more easily and required longer periods of rest between audiences. The emperor adapted his schedule gradually, maintaining his essential functions while acknowledging his physical limitations. The palace scriptorium continued its work throughout this period, with Charles taking special interest in the preservation of important documents and the completion of projects that had been years in development. He understood that written records would carry forward his achievements more surely than any monument of stone. The emperor's concern for documentation reflected his understanding of mortality and legacy. Religious observance took on even greater importance during Charles's final months. He increased the time spent in private prayer and meditation, seeking not only divine forgiveness for his sins, but also strength to complete his earthly duties. The emperor's faith, always genuine, deepened with the approach of death in ways that brought peace rather than fear. The Christmas season of 813 was celebrated with traditional magnificence at Aachen, though those present could sense that they were witnessing the end of an era. Charles presided over the festivities with his customary grace, but careful observers noted that he delegated more responsibilities to his son and relied more heavily on his staff when standing for extended periods. As winter deepened, Charles began to suffer from recurring fevers that weakened him considerably. Yet, even confined to his chambers, he continued to receive reports from throughout the empire and to make decisions on important matters. The emperor's dedication to his responsibilities remained unshaken, even as his body failed him. The scholarly community at Aachen maintained its activities throughout the emperor's final illness, understanding that their work honored both learning and their patron. Monks in the palace scriptorium copied manuscripts with special care, knowing that their efforts preserved the intellectual achievements of the Carolingian Renaissance. The sound of pens on parchment provided a peaceful background to the emperor's final days. Charles spent increasing time in reflection during his last weeks, considering not only his own mortality, but the future of the empire he had built. He had succeeded in uniting most of Western Europe under Christian rule, but he understood that human institutions required constant renewal. His final instructions to Louis emphasized the need for justice, learning, and devotion to the church. The emperor's family gathered around him as his condition worsened, providing the comfort of familiar faces and loving voices. His surviving children took turns reading to him from scripture and from the classical works he had always enjoyed. These quiet moments brought peace to a man who had spent most of his life dealing with the urgent demands of war and governance. Even as his strength failed, Charles maintained his concern for his subjects' welfare. He issued final instructions regarding charitable distributions to the poor and ensured that his personal treasures would be used for the benefit of the church and the empire, rather than merely enriching his heirs. The emperor's generosity extended beyond his death. The palace at Aachen took on an atmosphere of quiet anticipation as Charles's final days approached. Courtiers and servants moved with hushed respect through halls that had witnessed for decades of momentous decisions. The great emperor, who had seemed immortal in his prime, was revealing his human frailty, yet his dignity remained undiminished. On January 21st, 814, as dawn was breaking over the frozen landscape of Aachen, Charles received the last sacraments of the Christian faith. He died peacefully in the early morning hours, surrounded by his family and closest advisors. The emperor, who had lived with such energy and purpose, passed from this world with the same quiet dignity that had marked his greatest achievements. News of Charlemagne's death spread slowly through the empire, carried by mounted messengers who rode through winter storms to reach every corner of the realm. The grief was genuine and widespread, for people throughout Europe recognized that they had lost not merely a ruler, but the Ponte, architect of the Christian civilization that defined their world. The funeral arrangements reflected both Charles's imperial status and his personal preferences. He was buried in the octagonal chapel at Aachen that he had built and loved, laid to rest in imperial robes, but with the simplicity appropriate to a Christian monarch who had always remembered his mortality. The tomb was marked modestly, befitting a man who believed his greatest monuments were the institutions and culture he had created. Louis the Pious assumed full imperial authority without challenge, testament to his father's careful preparation for the succession. The transition was peaceful, and the empire continued to function according to the systems and principles that Charles had established. The great emperor's death marked the end of a life, but not the end of his influence. The immediate aftermath of Charles's death saw an outpouring of tributes from throughout the Christian world. Poets composed elegies celebrating his achievements, while chroniclers began recording the details of his reign for future generations. The emperor, who had patronized learning in life, became the subject of scholarship in death. The palace school at Aachen continued its work, though the atmosphere inevitably changed with the loss of its imperial patron. Students and teachers alike understood that they were carrying forward the educational vision of their deceased emperor. The preservation and expansion of learning remained central to the Carolingian legacy. As winter gradually gave way to spring in 814, life in the empire resumed its normal patterns under the new emperor's rule. Yet those who had known Charlemagne personally carried within them memories of a remarkable man who had transformed not only the political map of Europe, but the very concept of Christian kingship. In the quiet years that followed Charlemagne's death, as seasons turned and new generations grew to maturity, the true magnitude of his achievements began to emerge like stars becoming visible in the deepening twilight. This gentle biography now turns to the lasting influence of the man who had been called the Father of Europe, whose legacy would shape civilization for centuries to come. The immediate effects of Charles's death were surprisingly minimal, a testimony to the strength of the institutions he had created. The empire continued to function under his son Louis the Pious, and the administrative systems developed during the Carolingian Renaissance provided stability that outlasted their creator. The bureaucracy of educated clerics continued to manage governmental affairs with the efficiency that Charles had demanded. The educational reforms initiated by Charlemagne proved to be among his most enduring contributions to European civilization. The palace school at Aachen became the model for similar institutions throughout the medieval world. Cathedral schools and monastic academies carried forward the educational methods developed under imperial patronage, creating generations of literate administrators, clergy, and scholars. The preservation of classical texts during the Carolingian Renaissance cannot be overstated in its historical importance. Without the copying projects sponsored by Charles and his successors, countless works of ancient literature, philosophy, and science would have been lost forever. Modern knowledge of Roman and Greek culture depends heavily on manuscripts preserved in Carolingian scriptoria. Charlemagne's influence on the development of European languages was profound and lasting. The standardization of Latin encouraged by his court created a common, scholarly language that facilitated communication across linguistic boundaries. At the same time, the vernacular languages of his territories began to develop their own literary traditions, influenced by the cultural flowering of the imperial court. The legal legacy of Charlemagne shaped European jurisprudence for centuries. His attempts to create uniform legal standards while respecting local customs established precedents for later legal development. The integration of Roman law with Germanic, tribal traditions created the foundation for medieval legal systems throughout Western Europe. The architectural achievements of the Carolingian period continued to inspire builders and artists long after Charles's death. The palace chapel at Aachen became a model for church construction, while the broader architectural program of the imperial court influenced the development of Romanesque style. Many buildings constructed under Carolingian patronage survived for centuries, serving as visible reminders of the dynasty's cultural achievements. The concept of Christian empire that Charlemagne embodied became central to medieval political thought. Future rulers would look back to his reign as the ideal of what Christian kingship could achieve. The Holy Roman Empire, which emerged from the division of Charles's territories, explicitly claimed continuity with his imperial legacy. The relationship between church and state that Charles established influenced European politics for over 1,000 years. This model of the Christian emperor who protected the church while maintaining secular authority became the template for medieval kingship. The delicate balance he achieved between temporal and spiritual power provided a framework that later rulers would both emulate and modify. Trade and commerce throughout Europe continued to benefit from the stability and standardization that Charles had introduced. The unified currency and standardized weights and measures facilitated economic development that outlasted the political unity of his empire. Medieval merchants operated within commercial frameworks that traced their origins to Carolingian administrative reforms. The military innovations developed during Charles's reign influenced European warfare for centuries. The integration of different fighting styles and the systematic organization of supply lines became standard practices. The feudal military system that emerged from Carolingian institutions shaped medieval society and politics throughout Western Europe. Charlemagne's approach to governing diverse populations provided lessons that remained relevant long after his death. His combination of respect for local customs with insistence on overarching unity offered a model for future rulers facing similar challenges. The techniques he developed for integrating conquered territories were studied and adapted by later conquerors and administrators. The scholarly community that flourished under Charles's patronage dispersed throughout Europe after his death, carrying Carolingian educational methods to distant regions. Students trained at Aachen became teachers and administrators in their home territories, creating a network of learning that extended the Renaissance far beyond the original imperial court. The manuscripts illuminated during the Carolingian period became treasured possessions of medieval libraries and continued to influence artistic development for generations. The distinctive style developed by imperial scriptoria inspired countless later works, while the technical innovations in bookmaking improved the preservation and dissemination of knowledge throughout Europe. Charlemagne's commitment to Christian mission work had lasting effects on European religious development. The systematic conversion of pagan peoples established patterns of missionary activity that continued throughout the medieval period. The integration of newly Christian populations, key into existing ecclesiastical structures, created the religious unity that would define medieval Europe. The diplomatic protocols established during Charles's reign provided templates for international relations throughout the medieval period. His methods for conducting negotiations, arranging marriages, and managing alliances became standard practices. The imperial court's ceremonial procedures influenced royal courts throughout Europe. The agricultural innovations encouraged by Carolingian administration contributed to population growth and economic expansion that continued long after the empire's political fragmentation. Improved farming techniques and better security allowed for the clearing of new lands and the development of more productive agricultural systems. The development of vernacular literature received crucial encouragement during Charles's reign, even as Latin remained the primary language of scholarship. The preservation of heroic poetry and the emergence of new literary forms created cultural traditions that would flourish throughout the medieval period. The emperor's own interest in Germanic legends helped preserve cultural memories that might otherwise have been lost. Urban development under Carolingian rule established patterns that influenced medieval town planning. The growth of commercial centers and the establishment of markets created the foundation for the urban revival that would characterize later medieval Europe. Many cities traced their origins to settlements established or expanded during Charles's reign. The administrative techniques developed by Charles's government became the basis for medieval bureaucracy throughout Western Europe. The use of written records, systematic taxation, and regular communication between central and local authorities provided models that later kingdoms would adopt and refine. The professional civil service that emerged from Carolingian institutions influenced governmental development for centuries. Religious art and music that flourished under Charles's patronage continued to evolve and inspire new creativity long after his death. The standardization of liturgical chant created musical traditions that defined Christian worship, while the artistic programs of Carolingian churches influenced the development of medieval art. The integration of classical and Christian themes established patterns that would characterize European culture. The scientific and philosophical inquiries encouraged at Charles's court laid groundwork for the intellectual developments of later centuries. While limited by the constraints of their time, Carolingian scholars preserved and transmitted knowledge that would contribute to the eventual revival of learning in the High Middle Ages. Their methods of inquiry and their respect for ancient wisdom influenced later scholarly traditions. Charlemagne's personal example as a Christian ruler provided inspiration for countless later monarchs. His combination of military prowess with scholarly interests, his balance of justice with mercy, and his integration of faith with governance created an ideal of kingship that influenced medieval political culture. Stories of his wisdom and achievements became part of the cultural heritage of European nobility. The economic policies developed during Charles's reign continued to influence medieval commerce and industry. His protection of trade routes, standardization of currency, and encouragement of manufacturing created conditions that supported economic growth throughout the medieval period. The guild systems that emerged in later centuries built upon foundations established during the Carolingian Renaissance. The linguistic legacy of Charlemagne's empire was profound and lasting. Standardization of Latin created a common, scholarly language that facilitated communication across national boundaries for centuries. At the same time, his court's interest in vernacular languages helped preserve and develop the various tongues that would become modern European languages. As centuries passed, the figure of Charlemagne became legendary, inspiring countless stories, poems, and artistic works. The historical emperor was transformed into a mythical hero whose adventures were celebrated throughout medieval literature. These legends, while often historically inaccurate, testified to the enduring fascination with his achievements and character. The institutional church benefited enormously from patterns established during Charles's reign. His support for monasticism, his encouragement of clerical education, and his protection of ecclesiastical rights created conditions that allowed the medieval church to flourish. The partnership between church and state that he pioneered provided a model for medieval Christendom. Modern historians continue to study Charlemagne's reign for insights into medieval governance, culture, and society. His ability to unify diverse populations under effective administration offers lessons that remain relevant in contemporary discussions of political leadership and cultural integration. The documentation from his reign provides invaluable sources for understanding medieval life. The geographical extent of Charles's influence can still be seen in modern Europe, where many national boundaries and cultural divisions trace their origins to Carolingian institutions. The political map of medieval Europe was largely shaped by the administrative divisions and cultural patterns established during his reign. His empire's fragmentation created the kingdoms that would dominate European politics for centuries. Educational institutions throughout Europe continued to honor Charlemagne's memory as the patron of learning. Universities that emerged in later centuries often traced their intellectual genealogy back to the palace school at Aachen. The liberal arts curriculum that he encouraged became the foundation for medieval and Renaissance education. The peaceful transition of power at Charles's death demonstrated the effectiveness of his governmental institutions and his careful preparation of his successor. This stability provided a model for orderly succession that later dynasties would seek to emulate. The principle that imperial authority required careful preparation and popular acceptance became an important element of medieval political theory. Trade guilds and commercial associations that developed in medieval cities often invoked Charlemagne's name and claimed his protection for their activities. While these claims were sometimes historically questionable, they demonstrated the continued association of his memory with economic prosperity and commercial security. The standardization he introduced facilitated the growth of international trade. The cultural flowering that characterized the Carolingian Renaissance continued to inspire artistic and intellectual achievement throughout the medieval period. The integration of classical learning with Christian faith that marked his court became the defining characteristic of medieval European culture. His patronage established the principle that political power carried responsibility for cultural development. This bedtime history narration of Charlemagne's legacy reveals how a single life could influence the course of civilization for centuries. The institutions he created, the culture he fostered, and the example he provided shaped the development of European society in ways that extended far beyond his immediate political achievements. As our nightfall journey through the life of Charlemagne draws toward its peaceful close, we find ourselves in the quiet space between history and legend, where the man Charles becomes the eternal figure who will inspire generations yet unborn. This final chapter of our calming storytelling invites us to reflect on what true greatness means and how it echoes through the corridors of time. In the centuries following his death, the memory of Charlemagne grew beyond the boundaries of historical fact into something approaching myth. The Song of Roland, composed generations after his reign, transformed him into the ideal Christian knight, defender of the faith against overwhelming odds. These legends, while often inaccurate in detail, captured essential truths about his character and achievements that resonated with medieval audiences. The Holy Roman Empire, which claimed direct descent from Charles's imperial crown, maintained his memory as the foundation of their legitimacy. For over 1,000 years, Germanic emperors would seek coronation in the chapel at Aachen, where Charles was buried, drawing spiritual authority from proximity to his tomb. The imperial regalia included artifacts believed to have belonged to him, creating a tangible connection between past and present. Medieval literature throughout Europe celebrated Charlemagne as the archetypal Christian emperor. A French chansons de geste made him the hero of countless adventures, while Germanic epics praised his wisdom and strength. These stories, told and retold around countless firesides, kept his memory alive in popular culture long after the political structures he created had evolved beyond recognition. The Renaissance brought renewed scholarly interest in the historical Charlemagne as humanist scholars sought to distinguish fact from legend. Yet, even this more critical approach revealed the magnitude of his actual achievements. The preservation of classical learning, the administrative innovations, key in the cultural flowering of his reign, impressed scholars, who were themselves working to revive ancient wisdom. The Age of Enlightenment viewed Charlemagne through the lens of rational analysis, appreciating his role in preserving, learning, and promoting education. Voltaire and other philosophers, despite their criticism of medieval institutions, recognized his contribution to European intellectual development. His support for scholarship and his personal commitment to learning appealed to thinkers who valued reason and knowledge. Napoleon Bonaparte explicitly modeled himself on Charlemagne, seeking to recreate a unified European empire under French leadership. The comparison was not merely political. Napoleon genuinely admired Charles's ability to combine military conquest with administrative skill and cultural patronage. The Corsican emperor's coronation by the Pope deliberately echoed the ceremony in St. Peter's Basilica 8 centuries earlier. The Romantic movement of the 19th century rediscovered Charlemagne as a heroic figure who embodied the medieval ideals they sought to revive. Writers and artists portrayed him as the perfect fusion of strength and wisdom, courage and piety. The Gothic revival in architecture often included references to Carolingian styles, acknowledging his contribution to European artistic tradition. Modern historical scholarship has provided increasingly sophisticated understanding of Charlemagne's reign and its significance. Archaeological evidence, documentary analysis, and comparative studies have revealed the complexity of his achievements while confirming their fundamental importance. Contemporary historians recognize him as one of the pivotal figures in European development. The European Union of the 21st century has claimed Charlemagne as a founding father of European unity. The Charlemagne Prize, awarded annually for contributions to European integration, honors his memory as the creator of the first truly pan-European political and cultural synthesis. Modern European leaders invoke his example when discussing continental cooperation and shared values. Educational institutions throughout the world continue to study the Carolingian Renaissance as a model of how political leadership can foster intellectual and cultural development. Its approach to governance, combining respect for diversity with insistence on fundamental unity, offers insights relevant to contemporary challenges of managing multicultural societies.